James stared at the broken remains of the Colossus filled before him. A lake of blood was starting to ooze out of the corpse, so he spread it across the floor and towards James's feet. He was already covered in blood, but he still took a step back right before the thick liquid reached the tip of his toes. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Admir pulled him back into reality. Despite his obscured face, it was clear that the fake ambassador was also staring at the slowly deflating corpse, specifically at the large hole of shattered bone, behind which Dual Friend's brain used to be, although there wasn't much left of it now. The spongy organ had been turned into an unrecognizable mess of blood and membranes by the sheer concussive force of the bullet. Slowly, James let himself be pulled a few more steps back, away from the mortal remains of the enormous ball, and with a swipe of his arm, he cleaned the blade in his hand from the blood it had spilled, using his improvised clothes as an improvised rag. It was soaked already. A little more wasn't going to hurt. Afterwards, he secured the sword back into its sheath. The sound of wheels tearing across terrain now announced that their rides were getting considerably closer. It was time to get ready. James and Admir distanced themselves from the obstacle the course would provide and stepped a few meters apart from each other to give the bikes enough room to operate. James had to push what had just happened out of his mind, so he would have to concentrate. Already, he steeled himself for the upcoming impact, and he was determined to not mess up his timing. The bikes were now close enough that with every second, they nearly doubled in their perceived size as they rushed towards them. Just a few more seconds, and they would reach them. In his head, James counted down. Not real seconds, but an arbitrary amount of time he thought it would most likely take them to arrive. 3, 2, 1. Once the bikes were about 3 meters away from them, they suddenly and synchronously ripped their handlebars around, leaning to the side and letting their tires screech across the floor as they drifted around the waiting pair, one cycle for each of them. While watching, James incidentally noted the black surface of the ATC shimmer in the harsh starlight, and the reflective visors of the riders' helmets reflecting it blindingly, even as they kicked up enormous amounts of dust around them. However, he could pay no real attention to it, because soon, the rider circling him, which was the smaller of the two, held out their arm at an upwards angle to help him mount. James was really glad they had the necessary awareness to approach from his left side, but still had an arm that he could use to reach them. Once the drivers were on one level with them, James and Admir hooked into their held-out arms with their own, and jumped towards the direction the cycles were going in, allowing themselves to be pulled around by the vehicle's momentum, which basically threw them onto the backs of the bike seats. That was supposing they got their legs up high enough and far enough with good enough timing, of course. If they didn't, they would instead be thrown against the vehicle's armor and either bounce off it and land on their backs, or flip it over and eat a face full of dirt on the other side. An experience James had made not only once during training for this sort of mounting, onto an ATC. Luckily, if you fell on your face often enough while trying, you didn't forget how to do it right once you had it down, and after a moment of acting on instinct and muscle memory alone, he gladly realized that he was sitting on the seat of the cycle securely, and in one piece. Yet, just moments after he had this relief realization, the masked rider of his new mode of transport ripped around the steering and stepped on the gas so suddenly that the only thing James could do to not mess up the balance of his ride was to jolt forward and tightly wrap his arm around their waist, pressing himself to their back and holding on for dear life as they tore across the fields, leaving Admir and his driver behind in the dust. Great. He got the daredevil. Suddenly James was very aware that he neither had a helmet nor the same armoured overalls that his driver was wearing. He didn't even have proper clothes. If they crashed like this, it wouldn't end pretty. However, his curiosity still got the better of him, and he peeled himself loose from his driver for just a second to take a look back over his shoulder. One last look at the place that held him for so long. One last look at the man who gave up his life trying to stop him. It was almost philosophical in a way. The tall walls were broken. The fallen made the corpse of one of their protectors. And now James could see how, out of the smoke, another large figure stepped over the broken walls and into the open. Tua walked up to the corpse of her concubiness, and her trunk almost gently reached down to touch one of his broken tusks, gliding across it carefully. Then she lifted her gaze, looking after the retreating humans, who must be nothing but small dots to her vision at this point. James wondered what was going through her head at that moment. But he couldn't wonder for long, because right that instant, sirens were starting to wail all around them. Apparently, their presence in this place was officially acknowledged now. Andrej focused on not losing sight of James's back, as Tua was apparently determined to try and shake even her own teammates while transporting their target. She sped along, bopping and weaving her way around any obstacle without so much as slowing down in the process. Usually he'd admonish her, but with the sirens sounding now, maybe she had the right idea. "How is pickup looking?" Andrej asked over his connection to the pilot of their shuttle, who should be ready to get them out of here at this point. An awkward noise came back over the line, as the pilot was apparently at a loss for words for a second there. About that, sir, he said, his voice a bit hard to understand over the loud sound of the flying shuttle in the background. I'm basically ready to pick you up whenever, but, if I'm being honest, it's going to be healthier for all of us if I don't have to come down anywhere near the guys carrying guns that are bigger than me. I mean, it's your call, Major, but those things have a good amount of power behind them. The shuttle's armor is pretty good, but I honestly wouldn't trust it that much. What I'm saying is, get some distance. I'll hover around and come pick you up ASAP. Head towards coordinates at 618-255-900. Understood, Captain, Andrej replied, pressing his lips together tightly right after. Getting some distance, huh? Easier said than done. But with the added maneuverability of their ATCs, they might just pull it off. For now, they would have to get out of the city, away from the law enforcement. All of you got that? He asked his team over the line. You're the one driving. What the hell did you ask me for? Admir immediately gave back from his right behind him, although it was still easier to understand him over the communication. I gotcha, Tuya replied, and Andrej could see her swerve her bike in front of him, steering her towards their new destination. Clearly, James hadn't been quite ready for the sudden turn, as he seemingly clung onto her for dear life. Understood, sir. I'll be heading there as well, Sam finally replied. What's your status, Sam? Andrej immediately replied. We'll also bring his bike around towards the direction of the city's exit. Had a close call with my company earlier, but I managed to slip out fine, she replied, and he could hear leaves and twigs break under the wheels of her ATC in the background, as she apparently still drove through the woods. If she hadn't called in for it, it couldn't have been that bad. Still, he didn't like hearing about it only now. No more risks, got it? He ordered. We're finishing this nice and clean. I'll see you at the pickup. Yes, sir, Sam concurred, and Andrej focused back on driving. By now, some response vehicles were out and about. He could make them out among the civilians easy enough, as each of the large cruisers was marked with the family crest of the matriarchal family. Internally, Andrej made note of the fact that said crest had been curiously absent from anywhere in or around the high matriarch's estate, much different from how he would expect it based on his Earth-born assumptions and experiences. He couldn't ponder it, however, as he had to concentrate on dodging all the obstacles that a ride through the inner city brought with it. As long as they didn't slow down, they leave very little opportunity for an angle of attack for the pursuing Zodaitos. Zigging and zagging around corner after corner, the ATCs made their way through the wide streets, using the neighbouring sidewalks or alleyways as substitutes whenever necessary. Luckily, given how small they were in comparison to everything else, it must have been quite hard to get a fix on their location, given how easily they were obscured by the most mundane of objects around here. Of course, the same was not true for the ship far above their heads, which they would need to escape from the planet, but Andrej wasn't worried. The sun was able to defend herself just fine should the need arise. Still, they shouldn't push their luck any longer than strictly necessary. Despite the attempts of local law enforcement to block their way, they couldn't block every small gap just big enough for the small invaders to slip through. Soon, they had left the confines of the city behind them and reached the enormous surrounding farmland that seemed to encompass every inch of the planet that wasn't either inhabited or completely unusable for agriculture. Andrej felt the slightest bit bad about ruining a hard-working farmer's crops, as he saw Tuya dive into a field of some sort of high grass, or at least a similar plant, mowing down rows of it with her wheels in the process. However, a mission was a mission, and overall, the little tracks they would leave behind would likely hardly make a difference in the end. Still, it always irked him to damage something that had nothing to do with the mission at hand. What also irked him, as he drove into the field of tall greenery, was that he couldn't see anything anymore, and had to fully rely on his navigation. Tuya was mere meters ahead of him, yet all he saw was grass. Come in, Major. The voice of the pilot came over the communication once again. I'm listening, Andrej replied, trying not to lose his focus as blades of grass hit against him from every which way. You're being followed, the pilot said in a ruminative tone. Yeah, not shit. I'm well aware, Andrej answered, with a good bit of annoyance slipping into his tone. Yeah, no, I mean you're being followed by some guy, the pilot quickly clarified. One of the flying types, big and blue. He's gliding along behind you. Big and blue? That had to be the one from the estate. The one that hung around with the ivory tree thing. You think he will be a problem? Andrej inquired, trusting the pilot's opinion on the matter more than his own at that time. It doesn't look like he's armed, the pilot mused, and it sounded like he leaned over to look at something. I'd wager the worst he can do is fly into the engines if he wants to slow us down, and that'll do him little good. Want to shoot him down? Andrej thought about it, but ultimately decided against it. No, leave him be, he replied. We'll deal with him as soon as it seems like he'll become a problem. Then, after a moment of contemplation, he asked, Can you see Sam from up there? What's her status? The pilot chuckled. She's inbound just like you are. he informed briefly. "And for your information, you've had quite the head start by now. I'll be coming down right to the coordinates, so just be ready to hop in when you see me descending." "Roger that," Andres responded. "You could have just asked me yourself, you know," Sam now stated dryly, sounding like she was a tad insulted. "Listen, I can barely see my hand in front of my face in here," he countered, only slightly exaggerating his lack of vision in the field. "I'm not confident that you have any idea how close you are to my position." "Understood, sir," Sam answered, and Andres could almost taste the sass he radiated. By that time, the grass around him was wildly thrown around by a sudden gust of wind, the blades bending down more and more as the air pushed against them, parting and granting Andrej a bit more vision of the area around him, and especially the shuttle that was starting to descend to the ground right ahead of him. While they were in the field, Tui had widened the distance between them, and she and James were now quite far ahead of him. Now that the shuttle was coming in, she had to seriously throttle her speed, momentarily losing control over her hind wheel, and thus giving James a good shake before she regained control at an acceptable speed to be boarding. He could now also see that Sam wasn't too far to his right. Once she had spotted him, she also sped up, apparently determined to beat him to the shuttle as well. It was all the same to him, as long as they all got out of there. James watched with big eyes as the shuttle descended in front of him, pushing the massive grass around them apart as it loudly neared the ground, its ramp already open and extended. His driver wasted no time, having already very roughly decelerated beforehand, and just drove straight ahead into the shuttle, hitting the brakes hard once again as soon as they were up the ramp. James basically jumped off of the machine and almost landed on his hands and knees as soon as they had come to a halt. His driver also got off the bike and walked towards the open ramp, looking up into the sky as if they were searching for something. James took a few more seconds to catch his breath, thank his lucky stars, and vow to never drive with this person at the wheel ever again, before he followed to see what there was to see up in the sky. All the while, the rest of the team was steadily approaching. "A friend of yours?" the high and slightly distorted voice of his driver asked, once he stood right next to them. James could just about make out the form of the flying avian they were staring at against the blue backdrop of the sky. It pretty much had to be to seal. "Not exactly," James replied, wondering what the rookie of the group was thinking flying after them like this. The driver of the cycle that had not been part of their pickup, and therefore basically had to be Athena, which was also confirmed by the huge weapon strapped to her back, was now arriving, rolling up the ramp much slower than they had done before her. She nodded a quick greeting at James as she passed him to secure her bike inside of the shuttle. Right as she did, the avian above them suddenly shifted his path, swooping down in their direction steeply, while Admiral and his driver were just coming up to the ramp, forming the anchor of their group. Desil seemed to have some trouble flying in all the wind kicked up by the shuttle, but he managed to land anyway. Immediately, James's driver reached for a gun fastened to their hip, but James stopped them with an outstretched arm. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast," the so long unheard voice of Andrej informed him from behind, as his old team leader was likely watching him like an eagle at this point. "We're taking off." Desil had landed some distance away and was just staring at him, as the ramp slowly started to retract. It didn't seem like he wanted to say anything. It was like he just needed to see him leave with his own eyes. "I say further back, Tess," James shouted over the sound of the engines, and Desil seemed surprised that he would actually talk to him. "I think they're going to express us upwards. You don't want to be that close when that happens." The avian tilted his head curiously, as if he was wondering why James would even warn him. However, apparently he had learned that James's warnings were not to be ignored, as he started to step further away. The shuttle now started to lift off, and the ramp rapidly closed, only allowing James one last look at the retreating avian. Just why had he risked coming here, he wondered. "Sit down and strap in," the pilot of the shuttle suddenly ordered, turning in his seat to look at all of them. "They're worried about anti-air, so they're going to jump us up. Might be a tough ride." Having expected nothing else, everyone in the shuttle quickly hurried to their seats on the side, securing themselves in place with thick, heavy-duty seatbelts, not unlike those that now strapped down the ATCs as well. As soon as they had all gotten ready, the pilot gave the OK to the sun, and suddenly the room darkened, as all light out of the front window vanished while the darkness of hyperspace enveloped them. From the outside, James knew it was a very different sight. An explosion of light and colours, both perceivable and imperceivable to the human eye. With a technology as useful as hyperspace generation, no avenue remained unexplored. Right now, the sun was generating a stretch targeted at the shuttle, intended to give it a direct route to the orbiting ship at a speed faster than light, bypassing any defences that might have tried to stop it otherwise. Luckily, everything was aimed perfectly, and the ride wasn't near as rough as it could have been. Inside the shuttle, they noticed almost nothing of it, and within the blink of an eye, they were suddenly outside of the atmosphere, the planet's surface shining brightly underneath them, while the shuttle prepared to dock to the massive human flagship that was hovering in front of them like a dark wall. Meanwhile, The team began putting the breath filters and helmets off their heads, revealing the faces underneath them. Obviously, they had all gotten older in the last years, but James still recognized each and every one of them. They had matured, but overall, it didn't seem like they changed all that much. Just one face was unfamiliar to him, the driver he had shared a ride with earlier, who now unveiled her face to be a woman of his age, of Asian descent, with a green side cut on her head and a pierced nose. Admittedly, just a few years prior, James would have likely been utterly smitten at the sight of her, and he felt mighty silly for clinging on to her with all of his might earlier all of a sudden. For a moment, he wondered if he should introduce himself out of politeness, or if that was superfluous, since she clearly knew who he was already. However, before he came to a decision, reality suddenly caught up with him all at once. He was out. Out of the estate, out of the city, out of the planet. He was inbound to a human flagship. He was free. The realization didn't quite reach his rational mind yet, as his brain had to digest the information for a bit longer before it would know how to deal with the new situation, after it had numbed itself for so long, and ignored everything during the actual escape. However, his emotional core was a step ahead. He felt something wet on his face, and at first thinking it was blood, he reached up to wipe it away. However, the liquid was warm on his fingers, and much thinner than the blood that had spattered him earlier, so he pulled his hand away, looking at it. It was clear as day and glistened in the night, and he could feel more of it run down his face slowly. "Well, would you look at that?" he mumbled, not even quite able to process that he was crying for the first few seconds. "It's okay, man. Take your time," Admir said, discarding his breath filter onto the floor heedlessly and unbuckling his seatbelt, getting up and walking over to where James was sitting, still staring at his hand with tears running down his face. He gently placed a hand on James's shoulder, gauged his reaction for a second, and as James didn't pull away or anything of the like, he pulled him in closer, wrapping his arm around James completely, and gently pushing his head against his chest, getting blood and tears all over the good suit he was wearing without a care. James could feel Admir's fingers slowly and gently stroke for his overgrown hair, and bit by bit he started to sob, his arms shooting up to hug Admir tighter, his fingers clutching a handful of the suit's fabric. Admir continued to gently caress James's head, softly saying, "It's okay, it's okay. You're here now. You're home. We're here." He paused for a moment, leaning his head down to press a kiss on James's hair, as his face was still buried in Admir's chest. James couldn't reply. His breaths were just too shaky. Still, he tried to press out a "yeah," which came out as nothing but a hacky, sobbing laugh. Soon another hand joined Admir's on his back, and he felt someone lean against his other side, where they gently put their other hand on the empty, scarred joint that used to house his arm. "We're going to get you fixed up," Athena softly whispered, following the scar on his shoulder with her thumb, "and we'll make sure that those bastards get their comeuppance." James took a few quick breaths to try and find his voice again. He had to try a few times, because his first attempts all ended in sobbing coughs. Then, finally, he managed to somewhat get it under control, although his words were still everything but clear. "Thank you," he said earnestly, and pulled his hand away from Admir's back to reach for hers. While he closed his hand around her slender fingers, he suddenly felt something on them, something cold and metal. He studied it in between two fingers and lifted his head for a second to look at it. "You're still wearing it," he said, thinking aloud as he saw the small black ring she wore around her right middle finger. "I thought you didn't like it." Athena softly sniggered, grabbing his hand firmly. "It grew on me," she said, rubbing the back of his hand with her thumb like Admir had done earlier. Admir now slightly pulled away from James, opting to just sit down next to him with one arm around him, while laying his head on James's shoulder. This opened James's vision up to see Andrzej, who was standing tall an arm's length away from him, and stared down at him with his intense, blood-red eyes. "Hello, sir," James managed to get out, swallowing heavily to keep his voice clear from all the nasty things that ugly crime brought with it. Andrzej's lips curled into a soft smile, and he took a step towards James, crouching right down before his feet, and putting a hand on James's right knee. He then opened his armored overall, reaching inside, and, after some rummaging, pulled out a pack of tissues, handing one to James. James nodded thankfully, and had to let go of Athena's hand for a moment to take it, using it to first wipe away some of his tears, and then loudly clear his nose. As he had no place to put away the used tissue, he simply laid it down onto his leg after he was done, not like he could get any more dirty than he already was. Andrzej then stood up, reached for James's face with both hands and pressed a kiss on James's forehead, before crouching down before him once again. "Circumstances be damned, it is so good to see you again, James," he said, putting his hand back onto James's knee. "I know you may not feel the same, but we missed you, boy." James felt a new wave of tears welling up in his eyes, and not wanting to be entirely incomprehensible while trying to speak, he simply nodded. A bit apart from the touching reunion was their last teammate, whose name James still didn't know. She just kind of awkwardly stood off to the side, watching the display of intimacy with a mild discomfort, clearly unsure of how to act. James couldn't help but look over to her, trying to flash her an excusing smile, feeling her pain on a primal level. Of course, his team immediately noticed this and also looked over. Andres read the room right away and quickly stood back up, clearing his throat demonstratively. "Right, James. Allow me to introduce First Lieutenant Tuya Batar," he explained, pointing at his subordinate with an outstretched arm. "She joined our team after you quit. Tuya, you already know him, of course, but still, allow me to introduce James Aldwin. He was part of our team for the first 3 years after its inception, and used to listen to the codename Carbonado. He quit the military to pursue a higher education instead." He nodded towards James. "A degree in genetics and biotechnology, yes, I'm aware," First Lieutenant Batar replied, and gave James an appraising look that he admittedly didn't quite welcome in his current state. "I've heard a lot about you, both from the team and the mission briefing. Seriously, they talk a lot about you." "A pleasure, Lieutenant," James managed to get out, and the distraction caused by the introduction allowed him to regain some more control over himself, as the first overwhelming onslaught of emotion was starting to subside. He was out. He was out. He had persevered. He had survived. And most importantly, everyone else was safe too, even if that wasn't exactly because of him. "And what are you standing around over there for?" Admir suddenly chimed in, lifting his head for a second to look at his teammate judgingly. "Come on and get in here. You're part of this team too." Tuya pursed her lips bemusedly and shook her head. "I think I'll pass," she said, lifting a single hand to emphasize her refusal. "Your loss," Admir countered, immediately letting his head sink back onto James's shoulder. James couldn't help but chuckle at his audacity. There was no foot Admir wouldn't put in his mouth while speaking his mind, and he didn't care in the slightest about it. "Passengers will be landing shortly. Please return to your seats. Keep them in an upright position and prepare for gravity adjustment," their pilot loudly announced through the cabin, looking over his shoulder with an amused smile on his face. Each team member turned their face towards him for a second, before giving James one last acknowledging nod or encouraging pat, and making their way back to their own seats. Of course, they didn't know what was going on around the shuttle at that moment, but other teams were handling that. The landing itself was quick and smooth, and it took no more than a few minutes before they were safely coming to a halt in one of the sun's many huge docking bays. James soon felt the strain on his muscles, as the super heavy gravity on board took a hold of his body that was so used to standard at this point. It would take him some time until he was able to easily move around under these conditions again, but his genetics would kick in soon enough. He also noticed how cold it was, although that was everything but uncomfortable, even as goosebumps were forming on his skin. The heat and oxygen jar had been killing him for a while. After the atmosphere was reinstated in the shuttle bay, and the shuttle's ramp was opened once again, the team began to quickly clear out, while deckhands hurried in to take care of their equipment for them. As Tuya and Athena were already out, Amy stopped next to James for a second, with Andres looking on. "Can you stand?" he asked, with a hand on James's shoulder. "I think so," James replied, unbuckling his seatbelt and flexing his muscles against the gravity. And indeed, despite it never taken him this much effort to stand up before, he managed to get to his feet on his own. Flanked by the other two men, he then left the shuttle, and quickly found himself in the center of attention as soon as he stepped onto the deck. Of course, everyone knew why they were here, and as soon as he looked up, cheering broke out amongst the soldiers and deckhands around. "Mission successful!" one of them yelled out, while plenty of them either clapped or high-fived each other over a job well done. James laughed along with them for a moment, taking time to breathe as the excitement slowly died down. Just standing was exhausting, but they had earned their moment of celebration. Finally, as things were quiet again, just one pair of hands remained clapping, filling the room with a slow, even rhythm. At first it was tolerated, but then people started to look around, wondering who didn't get the hint that it was good now. One after the other, their eyes landed on someone standing at the entrance to the shuttle bay. A pale woman, with long, voluminous black hair, wearing one of the UHSDS pitch-black uniforms that imitated the night sky, with white dots symbolizing stars sprinkled across it. The uniform was decorated with multiple badges, emblems, and insignia, the most prominent of which were the 4 stars, identifying her as an admiral. Despite suddenly getting on in years, she still looked quite young outwardly, without so much as a grey hair or a wrinkle in her face. Fastened to her hip on one side was a long, fancy cutlass with a golden hilt and a pitch-black scabbard, and on the other, a large white pistol, clearly of high caliber. The people that noticed her quickly froze up, many of them instinctively standing at attention while others seemed shock-stunned at first. However, the woman ignored them, simply keeping up her slow clapping, while piercing into James with the gaze of her striking hazel eyes. "Admiral present!" One of the higher-ranking soldiers around finally had the awareness to call out, and the entirety of the shuttle bay snapped to attention, standing up as straight as they could, and saluting their superior. That was everyone except for James, who stared back at her with a mixed expression. Finally, the Admiral stopped her clapping, and instead crossed her arms. She looked around, taking in all the people saluting her with clear boredom in her expression, before slightly waving her hands and ordering, "At ease!" The soldiers and deckhands sunk into themselves slightly, and made sure to quickly make more than enough way for her as she started to cross the bay in large strides, the loud clacking of the heels of her shoes the only sound that could be heard echoing through the room. "Ambassador Aldwin," she loudly greeted, and once she had reached a semi-reasonable distance for a conversation with James, she abundantly spread out her arms, and her voice was high and happy, supported by the big smile on her face. So, she was an admiral now. James nodded at her respectfully, but constantly kept up his eye contact in the process. "Ma'am," he politely greeted back. The admiral stopped in her tracks, the smile slightly fading from her face, and her gaze turning a bit sharper. In his periphery, James noticed his former team slowly move some steps away from him, while the admiral, admonishing, replied, "That is mum to you, Mr. Aldwin." Some of the surrounding people looked around in surprise, but nobody was dumb enough to speak up. Even Tuya turned her head to shoot an almost shocked look at Andrej, so apparently this was news to her. The rest of the team, however, just looked around sheepishly, and took another step away from James, as they didn't want to be in the splash zone, so to say. All but Admir, who stuck a bit closer to James's side. Spite bubbling up within him, James looked at his mother deadpan. "I don't recall calling you that since," he started. However, the Admiral was quick to cut him off. "Your 16th birthday," she chimed in, apparently remembering the day just as clearly as he did. "Don't tell me you're still mad about that. A lot of people that age beg their parents to let them go skydiving." James scoffed, anger slowly building. "Yeah, skydiving, not space diving," he rebuffed grimly, "and with their friends for fun, not with a platoon in training." He must have looked like he wanted to go on, because suddenly he heard a hissing next to him. "Sst!" Abby tried to get his attention from beside him, whispering through the corner of his mouth. "Wrong place, wrong time, James." Subtly, Admin nodded towards the many people that surrounded them, who all were at his mother's command, and seemed at a huge loss when it came to what to do now. He was right. They should move this. However, Admir's valiant effort would not leave him unscathed, for now he had gained the attention of the Admiral. "Ah, First Lieutenant Rex, sir," she sharply addressed him, and James could see Admir stiffen up. Those two weren't exactly the best friends either. "It seems that the ambassador is in need of clothes. Would you go down to the storage and see if you can't find a fitting pair of pants for him?" Admir shot up straight and hit his heels together. "Yes, ma'am," he loudly replied, and immediately marched out of the shuttle bay without another word or a look back. After a moment of pause, his mother's full attention then fell back onto James. "Follow me," she ordered, turning on her heels and starting to walk away without waiting for his reaction or a reply. For a moment, James seriously considered yelling after her, "And what if I don't?" But he knew better than that. Much as he hated it, as she was the admiral of this ship, he had to talk to her, at least in a professional capacity. Resisting against that would make no sense. He'd at least have to give his testimony, his side of the story. And if she, as the admiral, insisted on taking it herself, well, then he had to live with that. The people they passed in the halls, they seemed to be incredibly narrow to James, who was just not used to human architecture anymore, were clearly confused by and interested in the blood-covered, half-naked man that the admiral had in tow. But obviously, nobody was going to ask about it. When they had finally reached his mother's office, which took some time since James had to take quite a few breaks to catch his breath, his body screaming under the super-high gravity, it was located almost in the immediate vicinity of the bridge. She wordlessly invited him in by leaving the door open behind her, and for a moment, but James's eyes stuck to the plaque next to the door for a moment. It read, "Admiral Sophia Krieger, UHSDF. Of course, usually that wouldn't have been surprising given it was her office. However, it shouldn't have been. So far, James was under the impression that she had gotten command over the sun temporarily, specifically for this mission. However, this plaque suggested otherwise. "Sit down," his mother's voice suddenly came out of the room. She actually made it sound like a request or an offer, instead of an order. She also casually switched back to both of their native language of German, immediately changing the aura she gave off to a far more familiar one. While he was ogling at the sign, she had already sat down behind her desk, which was thankfully human-sized, and she now pointed at the chair across from her. With a deep breath, he walked into her office, fully aware that he most likely looked like the cat who ate the canary as he did so, and he closed the door behind him. He then sat down in front of her, looking into her striking eyes. "You've really been around the block, huh?" she asked, folding her hands with her elbows on the table. James needed a moment to catch his breath now that he was sitting down, so it took a few seconds before he replied, "Can we keep the chatter to a minimum, please?" His mother scoffed and smiled at him slightly, asking, "What? You want to skip right to the yelling?" James took another deep breath. "Let's skip that as well," he responded. "For now, at least." It was inevitable that it would come to yelling. They both knew that by now. But right now wasn't the time for it. Admir had been right about that much. "Fine by me," his mother said with a shrug, and leaned back in her large armchair. James looked around the office for a moment. It looked just like her last one, with the same plants and shells all around him. "Since when did you have command over the sun?" he asked absent-mindedly. "I thought you wanted to skip the chatter," his mother teased, which earned her a spiteful glare from James. She rolled her eyes at him, but conceded, "Well, if you'd ever actually read my messages, you'd have gotten my invitation to celebrate my promotion with me. I was transferred command of this ship there. Surely Nia has tried to tell you about that?" "Leave her out of this," James immediately snapped. "Then don't bore me with questions you should know the answer to," his mother countered with a dark look. Fair enough, he conceded that round. She then shifted her tone, trying to sound more caring. "You seem exhausted," she stated, while watching him catch his breath. "You think?" James replied, unnecessarily aggressive, before catching himself in the act. "Skip the yelling," he told himself firmly. "Sorry, yes, the gravity is eating away at me. I'm not used to it anymore. It's also been a long day." "Then maybe we should move this to some other time," his mother mused aloud, and James quickly interjected, saying, "It's fine." However, in her typical fashion, his mother wasn't having it. "No, I think you should rest for a while. After all, you've been through a lot, and it's not like you're going anywhere. Besides, you're going to need your strength, and you need to clean yourself up. I even bought your skin cream," she explained, bringing a finger to her lips. Just at that moment, there was a knock on the door. "Come in," James's mother loudly ordered, and the door shot open, revealing Admiral on the other side, carrying a fresh uniform. "I got the clothes you were asking for, ma'am," he insincerely announced, looking at both James and his mother staring at him. "Perfect!" James's mother happily exclaimed. "Then you can show James for his room now. I'm done with him for now." James turned towards her, wanting to protest, saying, "But..." However, she immediately shut him down. "I said I am done with you for now. Go rest. We will see each other again soon enough." There was no arguing against her. James knew that. It would just evolve into them screaming at each other. Conceding, he wordlessly got up from his seat and started to walk towards Admir. At least, he would soon be able to wash himself and finally get dressed again. However, his mother wasn't quite as done with him as she had said yet. "One more thing, James," she loudly announced, making him turn his head towards her annoyedly, not bothering with a reply. Seeing this, she continued, "Don't eat anything for the rest of today, or tomorrow morning for that matter, and don't drink anything but water." James narrowed his gaze at her. "Why?" he asked, in what was almost a growl. She smiled a brief smile at him. "Well, isn't it obvious?" she said, pulling out her assistant and apparently starting to do some paperwork as she spoke. "Your operation is in the morning."